I first started studying and working on climate change because of my concern for how it was affecting our natural environment. But more recently, as I've learned more about climate change and its impacts on people, I've become more interested in aspects of climate justice. So I'm gonna share my screen here. Give me just a second. Here we go. Climate change is fundamentally a justice issue due to unequal responsibility for causing climate change, unequal vulnerability to climate change impacts, and unequal power to determine how our limited resources are going to be allocated and distributed in response to climate change. So I want to talk about each of these in a little more detail. So first we'll talk about unequal responsibility for causing climate change. And as a brief refresher, our climate is regulated by greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. And these include carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and sulfur hexafluoride. And these are called greenhouse gases because they act like the glass of a greenhouse in that they allow light from the sun to reach Earth, but then they reflect some of the heat back to Earth. And they act as kind of a blanket for the Earth and keep us at a nice, comfortable climate. So greenhouse gases are a good thing, but human activities, especially the burning of fossil fuels, has increased the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And as that concentration increases, global average temperatures also rise. And this has a number of consequences for natural ecosystems and for human communities around the world. So a study by Sampson et al. Looked at who is responsible for greenhouse gas emissions around the world. And this was a study in 2011 where they're looking at per capita carbon dioxide emissions. And when you look at per capita emissions, you see that these countries that are in red have higher emissions than those countries in blue. And so those countries in red are more responsible for causing climate change than the blue ones. You can also look at the United States specifically, and this comes from a 2007 study by Robertson Park. And while the United States comprises about 4% of the world's population, we're responsible for around 20% of global emissions. A more recent study by Oxfam looked at what they call lifestyle consumption emissions according to how wealthy individuals are. So if you look here at the x-axis, at the top, this is the richest 10% of the world's population. And the richest 10% are responsible for about 50% of total lifestyle consumption emissions, while the poorest half of the world's population is responsible for only 10% of total lifestyle consumption emissions. So when we look at responsibility for causing climate change, we see that developed nations are more responsible for causing this problem than less developed or developing. We see that wealthier individuals have contributed more to causing climate change than poor individuals. And there are also studies that have looked at gender and found that on average, men are more responsible for causing climate change than women. And then studies that look at race have found that on average, individuals with lighter skin are more responsible than individuals with darker skin. We also can look at unequal vulnerability to climate change. And vulnerability has to do with risk of exposure to an impact. So for example, if you live along the coast, you have a greater risk for being exposed to a hurricane. It also has to do with sensitivity. When those impacts occur, how sensitive are you to them? So we generally think of children and the elderly as being more sensitive to, for example, illnesses. And then the third component of vulnerability is adaptive capacity. What resources do you have access to help you mitigate the harm from these impacts? And those resources can include financial resources or skills or social networks, friends and neighbors that you can ask for help. So together, these three things make up vulnerability. In 2011, again, Sampson and his colleagues looked at these components of vulnerability around the world and again mapped them. And you can see these areas that are red have a high vulnerability to climate change impacts, while the areas that are blue have a lower vulnerability. Now, if we compare this to the earlier map that showed responsibility, and I had already mentioned this, we see that those who have contributed the least to causing climate change, who have contributed the least in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, are going to be most impacted by climate change. So again, climate change is fundamentally an issue of justice. And then there's a third aspect of climate justice, which is that those groups who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change also have less power to influence how our limited resources are going to be allocated and distributed in response to climate change. They have less power to influence what mitigation strategies are going to be used or who's going to receive financial assistance in adapting to these changes. And it's this third aspect of climate injustice that I've been working on in rural communities on Maryland's Eastern Shore on the Chesapeake Bay. So I want to tell you a little bit about that work. Just to get us oriented, Maryland there, circled in red, of course it's on the Atlantic coast. And if we zoom in, you can see that the Chesapeake Bay, it kind of cuts Maryland in half, and the Eastern Shore is this chunk of land here that is the east of the bay. And this figure shows that we were working, colleagues and I from the University of Maryland were working in 3 counties, and these gray boxes here show the approximate area of these rural communities in which we were working. And I want to share just a few things about these communities. The first is that these communities have very deep historic and cultural ties to the landscape. This area was first settled by Europeans in the 1500s. And this is a picture of Captain John Smith, who famously mapped the area between 1607 and 1609. And this is also an area where rural African American communities were settled after emancipation in Maryland in 1864. And both Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass are from this area. Another thing I want you to understand about this area is that it's primarily dependent on a natural resource-based economy. A lot of crab, blue crab, oyster, and fish are caught in the Chesapeake Bay. And historically, there was a seafood processing and tomato canning industry on the Chesapeake Bay. In this picture here on the left, you can see these women are picking crab meat to be canned. But since the 1950s, this area has started to struggle economically as pollution in the bay has diminished catches, and they've seen some of their food processing industry moved overseas. So one thing I want to point out, due to the lifestyle in these and the economy in these rural communities, these rural coastal communities on the Eastern Shore have a relatively low responsibility for causing climate change. They also have a relatively high vulnerability to climate change impacts. And this is an aerial photo of one of the communities in which colleagues and I worked. This right here is Deal Island. And up at the top, that's the Chesapeake Bay. And then all of this rust color along the bottom is tidal wetland vegetation. And much of that is inundated much of the time. So you can see that these rural communities on the Eastern Shore are just utterly surrounded by water. And so they have a high vulnerability to climate change impacts, especially sea level rise. And it's already affecting them in a few ways. So first is that they're seeing flooding, and this is a picture taken on a sunny day. And this is an increasingly common sight on the Eastern Shore, where roads will be flooded to a point that school buses can't pick kids up. Residents have to put on their boots just to walk across their yard. A second impact from sea level rise is accelerated rates of coastal erosion. And then a third impact is salinization of the soil and groundwater. And that's evident in this picture by this stand of loblolly pine. You can see it's dying off. And loblolly pine is actually really common on the Eastern Shore, but it doesn't tolerate salt water. So they can actually watch the progress of salt water moving inland as these loblolly stands die off. So the state of Maryland is actually really working hard to address climate change, and they've been working on it since at least 2008. However, because these rural communities don't have local level government, they're unincorporated, they remain disconnected from the county and state level resources, technical resources, as well as some financial and planning resources. And the state, because it's disconnected from these rural communities, isn't understanding or gaining knowledge about what they're experiencing. And so this is this third aspect of climate injustice, where these rural communities are being excluded from climate change decision-making, and their needs are then being overlooked. So colleagues and I wanted to find a way to bring together, to build some networks between these rural communities that were on the front lines of climate change and experiencing it in their daily lives, and these county and state government employees who were working really hard at adaptation plans and mitigation plans, and to bring them together so that they could learn from each other and come up with strategies that would meet both these sort of statewide goals, but also meet local needs. So to do that, we decided to work with rural churches. I'm going to check my time here. One of the reasons we wanted to work with the rural churches was because there was some level of distrust between the state level government and these rural areas. So by working with churches, which are widely distributed in these rural areas and have a diverse membership and are really familiar with community needs and local environmental changes, and they're very highly trusted, we were able to recruit rural residents to participate in this project. But we also needed an approach that would facilitate meaningful engagement. And I think, Doug, your graphic that you showed from the Pew poll, where it showed how politically polarized we are in this country on climate change, we were dealing with that as well. And so we were bringing together this group of people that came from all across the political spectrum, that had different forms of knowledge. Some people were viewing it as a scientific, technical problem, while others it was their daily experience, and all sorts of different perspectives. We were dealing with science and faith and these issues that were very contentious, and a lack of trust. And so we needed to be able to transform this dichotomous, polarizing dialogue and disengage from that, to bring people together to be able to move forward to try to address these issues. And so we used an approach called collaborative learning, and it was developed by a couple of environmental scientists. But as we worked on this, I kept thinking of Mennonites, because it's so much in line with Mennonite values in terms of really listening to all the stakeholders and transforming conflict. So we did see by using this approach, we were able to move past these points of conflict. We were able to build mutual understanding. We increased trust among our participants, and they started to develop a range of strategies to meet multiple goals. And so what can the church do to address climate change? Well, we need to all do our part to try to reduce emissions. And I think the church can be supportive of that on a couple of levels. Of course, individuals need to try to make changes to our lifestyles, and that's hard, and it's also discouraging. And if I think if the church can be positive and encouraging, we hear so much bad news, but to lift up positive examples and aspirational goals, I think that would be a really important way for the church to help support individual change. But we also need cultural and policy changes. So as Doug mentioned, how can we work together collectively to transform how our community is living? And then we need to recognize that many people are already having to cope with climate change impacts. And we need to walk with these people and advocate for them. And I don't want to take more than my time, so I'll just conclude by saying that I think we have been focused for a long time on transforming conflict and working to promote peace, and climate change is another issue in which there's going to need to be a lot of work to transform conflict and promote peace. And so we've got a lot of good work ahead of us. Thank you.